What's my work about? That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? It's about opening to the mystery, about releasing everything we think we know, and about an exploration of these two qualities through the physical, through the interior, through the mind, and really through reality as a whole. My name's Craig Mallett, and welcome to the Aware, Relaxed, Connected podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. It is the end of May, and I'm just scraping in for a May podcast. These things have kind of become monthly by habit now, but I always mean to do them more regularly and then don't for whatever reason. So we'll see how it goes after this. But this week, I've been having a few conversations with my friends who are martial artists and some of my students too. And I really wanted to do the martial arts episode. I wanted to go on to my take on these things and a few other things like this. So to look at the martial arts really clearly is what I'm aiming to do here. And we have to kind of divide up martial arts into a few big categories. So first of all, you have, let's call them practical martial arts. These are martial arts that are meant to be used for self-defense, for, if you get mugged, what do you do about it? And all the rest. And the tone of these arts is very particular because the tone is there's someone trying to harm me somehow, and I don't really want to harm them because you can get in a lot of trouble with the law, and so you have to deal with that and get away. If you want to learn about this stuff, my personal take on this is you really should do like a proper self-defense course. And the good self-defense courses are mostly about super, super simple things. So this idea that you can learn how to be Jackie Chan and like do all these crazy moves and get away is really a big fantasy. But we'll come back to the fancy moves because they have other uses. But as far as self-defense goes, the biggest thing you need is awareness, situational awareness more than anything else. So you need to be able to read a room. You need to be able to pick up on dodgy characters. You need to be able to pick up on like approaching intent to do ill will and things like this. So situational awareness is by far more useful in this scenario than anything else. There was a YouTube clip I watched a while back. I'll have to dig it up. The guy has a martial arts channel and he's a martial artist, and he actually talked about getting into a fight in the street with some guy who his dog came out. The guy's dog came out, I think by memory, and tried to bite him. So he kind of booted the dog, and the guy wasn't really happy with that. And this kind of confrontation took place, and when the guy was reflecting on it, he said the first thing that came to him, he was in a foreign country, I think it was Portugal, and he said the first thing that came to him wasn't like which sick moves he's going to do on this guy. It was really, I'm going to be in trouble here. I don't know if there's if he's got friends just around the corner. He came out from a building, it might be full of people. I don't know if the police will take his side because I'm a foreigner, so whatever I do, maybe I'll get in trouble anyway. So there are all these like hesitations where even in the one situation where you think you could use all of the like eye gouging, death moves, whatever people brag about their martial arts being able to do, he still couldn't use it. And he ended up actually handling the situation quite nicely by his recounting of it. And mostly that was because he stayed calm, he protected himself, and he just kind of booped this guy with his elbow in a very simple way, which de-escalated the whole thing, luckily for him. But it's really, this, especially if you get back into the 80s and all these, 80s martial artists, you have these demonstrations that are like, if he does this, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to break his arm, I'm going to tear his eyes out, and I'm going to crush his balls or whatever it is, that like essentially saying they're going to dismember and disfigure this person. And there's just nothing at all realistic about that. That is not something that anyone realistically can turn to for practical self-defense. You need a self-defense that keeps you safe, that does the least possible damage to the other person so you don't get in trouble. Of course, you have the idea of like survive first. So, ask for forgiveness, not for permission, but still, you're not wanting to murder people essentially in a self-defense situation. You're wanting to protect yourself and essentially get out of it or de-escalate the situation. Um, the issue I see with most martial arts, especially traditional martial arts, is they have this like, we're teaching that. And it really isn't. It's not that it's bad stuff that they're teaching, but it's just not that. It's not really going to help um, in those situations. It's not going to help in most violent confrontational situations. And we'll get into why that is in a sec. The second category, so you've got the first category, which is like you're kind of, the streets. You're on the streets, the martial artist for the streets, and someone's mugging you or someone's like come into conflict with you and you have to resolve that. So there's a whole category of systems that deal with this. And honestly, they're better to go to those because they're people who have trained in these situations and maybe worked as bouncers or whatever, who are just sharing practical tips that work for them. I'd much rather send someone to one of those classes than like a karate class or a kung fu class or anything like this to learn self-defense. If you're going to learn self-defense, you need people who've actually been in these situations to share with you the reality, and you need some sort of pressure testing on top of that. There is a category here that I'm not really going to talk about, but there's a category of martial arts that's actually like military arts. I've got some friends who are ex-military and having to like go into war zones and ending up, most of the time they use their weapons, right? They're using guns and things like this, but occasionally you end up like face to face with someone and it's too close to use that. So you end up in like a hand-to-hand scuffle. And in these situations, there's some stuff to do that, again, the traditional martial arts aren't that great for. They're not going to teach you this, and they're not going to teach you this for a very specific reason, and that reason is adrenaline. Um, it's kind of the same with sports fighting, which is another category. Sports fighting is maybe the third big category. So like self-defense in realistic self-defense situations, and then military arts, and then sports fighting. In sports fighting, you have all the competitive arts like judo, jiu-jitsu. These are fantastic. These have their place. They're obviously where you get to see the rubber hit the road. You're stepping out of theory and into practical application. They still have a particular tone. When you go into a sports fight, even though you're facing off against someone who really is trying to hurt you, you know in the back of your mind somewhere that there's a ref there, and that if things get too hectic, the ref is going to stop the fight and they're going to pull you apart and all the rest. You also know that there's a rule set that means the other person and you can't do certain things. You can't, eye gouge and all these things. And you'll often find like whatever this like stuff that you can't do is the stuff traditional martial artists said, yeah, but because that's not in that sport fighting, I can do that. And because I train that, I'd be able to get the best of these sports fighting people. And I just don't think that's the case either. That's just a bit more wishful thinking. What you have common in all of these situations that I've just described that isn't in most traditional martial arts is facing off against someone who's actually intending to harm you. And that makes a big difference. If someone's actually intending to harm you, it changes things. And the main thing it changes is adrenaline. So if you have a system that is claiming that it's teaching some sort of effective martial capacities, and you're not learning how to operate under severe adrenaline, then the system is really maybe wishful thinking. There may be dressing something up in a fantasy that has a different reality to it. The idea that in theory and practice, theory and practice are the same, but in practice they are not. You need the practical application of martial conflict to test if your martial techniques work. Typically speaking, if you get into one of these actual conflicts, the thing that's going to change everything is adrenaline. So adrenaline comes into the system and pushes you into a fight or flight mode. It brings all of your resources out to the limbs. You'll get this like shaky hand. You'll lose fine motor control, really important. Um, so you won't be able to do very like clever technical stuff with your hands. You will also basically lose 100% of your rational, reasonable power and like revert to a caveman kind of mindset where you don't really have much control over anything. Your system's going to go into instinct and react on that. To give you an example of this, my brother, who's a little older than me, is a reasonable martial artist. He spent some time boxing in a gym. He was pretty good at sparring in boxing, even sparring against guys that are, going reasonably hard. But I've seen him in a number of fights and none of the boxing stuff was anywhere to be seen. And the reason for that is he had a big adrenaline dump. And when the adrenaline dump came, he went a bit feral. When he went a bit feral, all these techniques went out the window and he was just flailing. May as well have been an untrained bar brawler rather than actually, fighting with any of these strategies that he'd learned. And I've seen that happen over and over and over again. You have all these people that have grand ideas about how things happen, and then those ideas go out the window when the adrenaline hits. And as Mike Tyson famously said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So when this adrenaline hits, you actually just lose a whole bunch of your capacities. Everything you think you can do is not going to work. About 60% of the stuff that, or maybe 40 or 50% of the stuff that you've trained is not going to work. There's going to be like 50% of everything you've trained is going to be in so deep that it comes out as reactionary, instinctive capacity. And most of it's not going to have any kind of nuance as into like how to very technically apply certain things. It is possible to stay clear in an adrenaline dump, but that is just not going to happen the first time. It's not going to happen the 10th time. You need to actually regularly train invoking an adrenaline dump and then training under that situation and bringing back your clarity of mind and things like that while the adrenaline is running to be able to effectively operate under there. If you've never ever trained under adrenaline, your stuff is probably not going to work. It's probably not going to work. So just keep this in mind. Now, what I see with traditional arts is that you'll have so many demos where someone does something like there's an instructor and a student and they're doing a little demo about how this stuff's meant to work, and the student throws a punch and the instructor proceeds to do about 400 different moves on this arm that's just held outstretched while the student just stands still. This couldn't be further from the truth. Even if the student is feeding a more realistic punch like a jab that retracts, still it's unlikely that it's going to be that neat in real life, in real situations. So yes, there's a limit to what you can demo, right? You will need to demo somehow and it's going to be limited. But if you're not clear about it being a demo and it not working like that in a real situation, then you're going to kind of bring fantasy into the situation. You're going to bring this kind of like idea that you can do stuff that you can't really do. So to train this stuff properly, you really need to have adrenaline dumps invoked regularly. I've got a few friends who train legit martial arts. My friend Alex, who I'll get on the podcast at some point soon, he's a good buddy of mine. He was trained really traditionally, and the way he was trained is just constantly fighting. There's a video of him and his instructor is at a martial arts tournament, and the instructor was looking around, looking at all these demos where guys are throwing these punches like I'm talking about, and people are showing all sorts of fancy things you can do at an outstretched arm with the other person not responding at all. And the teacher's just going, "This isn't fighting. We have to do actual fighting if we're at a martial arts tournament." And so for their demo, what he said to his students is he just said, "Fight me." And the students obliged, and it's quite an incredible video. The instructor actually gets crash tackled at one point. It's a huge mess. There's not really that many super fancy swanky moves, but you see the instructor actually like keeps the distancing, the spacing right. He deals with the chaos, and he's totally comfortable in the big mess that ensues. You can also see the shock of the crowd, and this is telling for the martial arts community in general that when there was an actual fight at a martial arts event, they were all shocked. They didn't know what to make of it. They were just sitting there going, "Huh, what's going on? This isn't the nice depots we're used to. What are these guys are maniacs? Why are they doing this?" And it gives you some insight that they would react like this to a fight in a martial uh, event, right? It'd be like two boxers going at each other, and one boxer punches the other one, and everyone gets like surprised by that. It shouldn't happen if you're training martial arts seriously. Um, so there's this real need to experience the feralness of a real fight too, the absolute chaos. Again, going back to my brother, he's sorry, bro. You're being my example for a while if you listen to this, but I remember a really clear memory of being like out when I was, I don't know, 18, 19 or something at a club, and some sort of scuffle broke out. I didn't see who started it, but two guys tried to grab my brother, and he went feral, and he was thrashing so incredibly hard that these two guys couldn't do anything about it. He was just like a rabid dog with arms and legs just flailing everywhere, with no sense of like technique or anything about him. But because he was going so feral, these guys trying to control him, two of them, two big guys, couldn't control him and were copying random like elbows and hands and shoulders and whatever else in their attempts to control him. So if you haven't dealt with this kind of chaos, then you're going to have a big surprise if you get into any kind of fight. I don't know. I've seen a lot online, and I've heard a lot of stories of people who are like, I don't know, sixth degree taekwondo people or karate people or kung fu people or whatever. And they end up at a pub, and, some big pub brawler who fights for a pastime every weekend starts to make some trouble. And they think they're this like super shit hot, like, I've got this seventh dan thing, and tried to deal with this guy. And the big brawler, of course, had been very, very experienced at fighting. And the taekwondo or karate guy or kung fu guy, whoever it was, traditional martial artists, thinking that fights worked like the drills, which they do not, got a very nasty wake up call, and they get glassed or they get the snot beaten out of them or whatever. And this is a really common story. You can go online and find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these stories of these people who had like these wake up calls that their martial art didn't work martially. It didn't work in an actual fight. It only worked in the specific way that they trained it, where their partner was, feeding them with a rule set that said you can only tap me like this or you can only kick here. And when that rule set disappeared and there was just some feral bogan there who wants to smash them, then there was some trouble and an inability to deal with that. So if you're a traditional martial artist, I'm not trying to hate on you, because I think the traditional martial arts have a lot of value. I think it's just good to be clear about what you're doing and what you're not. Every single person I know who's trained traditional martial arts has done a lot of fighting, a lot of actual fighting. All the good martial artists I know who are traditional martial artists went and got jobs as bouncers at like the most feral club they could find, so they could test their stuff in reality, having to bounce people out of clubs. Of course, you're not meant to hurt the patrons when you bounce them too much. Depends on the club, I guess. But having to deal with all these really, really random situations at the very least. I know my friend Alex, and I'll get him to tell some of these stories when he comes on the podcast, but he spent a lot of time in China, and his teachers would just take him and he's like, fight that guy. And they'd have to fight until they had bloody eyes and maybe broken arms or whatever. And then they'd go, okay, that's enough, and then drag them apart, and they'd go patch them up, and then do the same thing the next day, and that would continue for months, like lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of fights. And he was even saying, like, you'll just lose your first fight. That's just the reality of it. When you're not used to it, you'll probably lose your first fight. It's not a problem. You've just got to do that and get past it and then keep going. So I think it's really important to keep this reality with the martial arts, to know that if you haven't been in an adrenaline dump and if you haven't been in an actual fight, I would be very, very dubious as to whether you know for certain your stuff works. It might work in your head, but does it work in reality? There's only one way to find out, to go get in a fight and see what happens. And a fight's a very, very different thing to even friendly sparring. If I go to a boxing gym and, I strap up and I get a guy and we're kind of doing a bit of sparring, that's a different tone. It doesn't have the same someone's trying to hurt me stakes at it. Even sparring, even friendly sparring, I do some friendly sparring with some of my friends, and it's just not the same. It's friendly. You can just say, "Hey, I just need a moment at any time." You can stop and talk about techniques. Um, you need to actually fight. You need to fight, and you need to fight not just once or twice, a lot. Now, personally, I have been in one fight in my entire life. I didn't want to be in that fight. It was, again, when I was young, in this clubbing era of my life, and I was just on the dance floor. A bunch of my mates at the time were b-boys and break dancers and all the rest, and so we were having a lot of fun with all of that kind of stuff. And a guy wasn't really happy that we were doing that. He thought we were losers or whatever for doing that, and kind of come to let us know about that. And one of the ladies we were with just did a little like hit bop on him, and he was really drunk, so he went flying way, 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 like must have gone at least 20, 25 meters away. And we all kind of just went, that was funny, and shrugged and didn't think much of it. But the guy must have thought it was me that shoved him because he didn't see who did it. And he came back just seeing red. And his opening move, I guess he'd watched a bit of UFC, was a flying knee at me, right at me. So he like ran at me and then jumped with his knee forward to try and take me out. I don't remember thinking about it, but what happened is I stepped aside and he kind of just flew straight past me, and then he turned around and he tried to kick me. He was so drunk that he was off balance, and I just ended up catching the kick with my arms under my left arm. And then the guy was on one leg. I was holding his other leg, so he was kind of like hopping about, and he was trying to throw fists at me. So I just buried my head in his chest, where it's too close for him to get any real leverage on me at that position. And I kind of just marched him. So he was like hopping backwards as I like marched forward, holding his leg with my head buried in his chest, and just happened to march him straight into a bouncer. And that club was pretty well known for the bouncers not being the nicest, so I'm pretty sure he got a good flogging out in the alleyway, or whatever bouncers do with patrons like that at places like that. But the point was, like, no, I'd been training martial arts for a couple of years at this point, and no fancy stuff came out. I didn't do any of the trips I'd been practicing. I didn't do any fancy, like, whatever. Actually, the thing that came out, how I grabbed his arm and marched, was the thing I'd trained the most. At the time, I was training a system called Xini Liuhe, and one of their primary practices is called the rooster walk. And if you know this walk, it really looks like all your arms are on one side and you're kind of just marching. Um, so it was pretty much this that came out. At the time, I wasn't like, I'm going to use the rooster walk to defeat this guy. It was just what came out. I didn't think about it. It was mainly because he tried to kick me and I just had his leg. And then we were on a crowded dance floor, and I didn't know what to do. So, and he was off balance. So I was just walking, keeping him off balance while he was trying to throw fists at me and just missing horribly. And he went straight into the bouncer, and I was fine. And the thing that I actually took away from that, the thing that I really liked, wasn't that I had any fancy moves, but that I managed to stay reasonably calm and collected in amongst it all, because I had a few friends who didn't mind a good fight in the group I was with, and they were like seeing red. They're like, we're going to find this guy, he shouldn't have done that. We're going to go beat him up. And I was like, chill, guys. We're just like, the bouncers have taken care of him. Barely had a scratch on me. I think he'd kind of grazed my ear a little bit, but otherwise I was fine. And I managed to like calm them all down, and we just went back to having a good night. And for me, this is where the traditional arts really shine. It's not really about the techniques that you use, because they're pretty much mostly useless. There are some ways to train them that's useful, but mostly you're not going to see all that stuff come out in a in a real conflict. Um, Unless you're training like an absolute maniac, or unless you're doing the way I talked about Alex training, where you like train all that stuff and then you get put in fights constantly to kind of tease it out. Then it might come out. But if you only train the drilling and you've never done fighting, it's very unlikely that it's going to come out in any kind of conflict that you have. So why would you do the traditional arts if they don't actually, we're doing martial arts and they don't actually work for martial purposes? Um, it's a funny thing. I am very clear with my students that I am not a martial artist. I tell them this over and over again. I trained martial arts for since 2003 now, so getting on 23 years as we record this. But I'm not a martial artist. I've been in one fight my whole life, and otherwise, I've never really had to use my stuff. I don't know if it works. I don't know if my brain will error if I got mugged or something. I really don't know. And this, I think, if your case is similar to mine, it's good to be really clear about this. To be like, okay, I've trained a lot of stuff. 23 years of training, lots of different systems of martial arts, and I don't know if it works in a fight. For me, that's not a problem because, like I said, fights, well, I've had one fight in my whole life. So I don't see the point in attending to something that is such a small percentage of my life. I just personally, it doesn't make sense to me. I know some people are in it for the love of the art and things like that, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not a fighter. I don't want to fight. All the other confrontations I ever had when I was out and about with my friends in these kind of, late teens, early 20s clubbing scene, I just de-escalated verbally. And most of the time, it was just kind of ignoring whatever the person was doing and being friendly to them and offering to buy them a drink or something like this. So, you'd have the classic, I'd be in the club holding drinks or whatever, and some guy would walk past and like drop his shoulder into me. And I'd turn around and I'd say something like, "Oh, how's your night? There's lots of pretty girls here, aren't there?" And they'd immediately go like, "Oh, yeah." And I'm like, having much success with the ladies. Yeah, totally. These guys who are into these big kind of alpha male demonstrations don't want to look like weaklings, so of course they've got to talk themselves up. And so I just let them do that. I let them talk themselves up. And then, I just say something like, you want a drink or something? I'll shout you a beer. And usually they'd be like, sure, free drink. And I'd buy them a drink. And it's like, at the time, beer probably cost $4 or whatever it was. And I'd buy them a drink and crisis averted. And that happened more times than I can count. And for me, that's way, way, way more useful than doing any of this fancy, well, if he shouldered me, then I would have turned and tricked him like this and smashed him like this. That doesn't make any sense for 99.9% of what's going on. Now, I have to put a little caveat star that I live in Australia, and Australia is, in the scheme of things, an incredibly safe place. It's very unusual to hear about violent crime of any kind. It's very, very unusual to hear about, knife stuff, gun stuff is almost, once in a blue moon, kind of, you hear about it on the news. But generally my day-to-day life isn't worrying about, is someone going to mug me? It hasn't been for most of my life. For 99.9% of my life, I've just been it's more social and worrying about, if you offend someone because you said the wrong thing or stupid stuff like this. But I'm not worried so much about physical violence. And particularly now that I'm out of these clubbing years, that I'm 40 now, I have a family, there's just no violence in my life, which I'm very grateful for. I do know that some people live in places like London and in Paris where the rate of crime is much higher, and you might actually find yourself in these situations despite your best efforts to avoid places that are dangerous. This danger is more prevalent in places like that. So in those situations, it's probably worthwhile putting a bit more attention into self-defense than I have put. But again, it's useful to be realistic about it. Go to an actual self-defense class where every single week they're going to put you under pressure, where you're struggling, where it's kind of chaotic. If there's no chaotic pressure and it's just clean drills where you're doing very fancy stuff, then walk away and go find some other place. And again, 99 times out of 100, this place is not going to be a traditional martial arts place. It's more going to be like an ex-military guy who's a security advisor for journalists in war zones giving actual advice of how to do with violence, or someone who's just studied a lot of street violence and crime and stuff like this and is sharing good ways to deal with that. So I'd really, still for this situation, stay away from traditional martial arts. So what are the traditional martial arts good for? Well, plenty of things. The martial drills I actually really like, not for the purpose of becoming an elite fighter who can do fancy moves, but more for pressure testing the qualities. And the qualities I like training: opening, releasing, being connected to yourself, being clear of mind, being connected to reality. These qualities disappear very easily when pressure gets put on. So if you have a basic drill, like, say like Wuji, right? If I'm standing in Wuji, and I'm doing my opening and releasing, then I can get someone to shove on me lightly, and it's difficult. It's more difficult to keep connection with my Wuji. And if they shove like slowly, I can learn to deal with that pressure. And what I can do with good drilling is I can build up that pressure and make it more chaotic, to the point where the shoves are coming like more violently, more sharp, more aggressively, more chaotically, faster, whatever. And as my capacities build, I can like step up the chaos. And then having someone like strike you, for example, not trying to hurt you, but just as an escalation of that pressure, is another good way to train under some chaos. Now, striking drills are also very, very interesting. I've got a bunch that I use where your face gets awfully close to your friend's fist. And even when the friend isn't trying to hurt you, if the fist is coming close to the face, there's like an unconscious response in the system that'll go, ooh, and like flinch at that. And training that can be very, very interesting for all sorts of psychological reasons, to feel comfortable with power coming close to your face. Not hitting it, but coming close to it is really really useful in day-to-day life. It will make you, if you can deal with physical power coming close to your face, it's much easier to deal with like emotional and mental power. So if you're at work and your boss is yelling at you, and you're used to being very, very close to like fists almost clobbering you in the face, even if it's from a friend who's not really trying to hurt you, but you're doing a drill, then this actually like translates quite well to those situations. This can like teach you how to deal with this different kind of pressure. If it's emotional or mental, it's actually much easier to deal with than physical pressure. So if you get used to dealing with some physical pressure, then these situations where, you disagree with someone, or someone's trying to tell you something you don't like, or you're trying to tell someone else something they don't like, it can really like help with maintaining composure in these situations. And the situation with the boss yelling at you isn't particularly physically dangerous. It's not like they're going to like just pull out a knife and stab you because you didn't do your job properly. Like the worst case is you might lose your job and have to go get a different job. Uh, but at any rate, the physical training from martial drills is very, very useful to this and translates to this. One of the things I work at with some of my students is there's psychological restraint, both in receiving power and in expressing power. What does this mean? So let's look at receiving power first. And one of the things I really like to train with people, even people who aren't into fighting, is the iron shirt. And the iron shirt is this practice where you like strike your body and you do this kind of thing where you're like smacking yourself, basically, like striking yourself. And you're just building up the heaviness of that strike and the power of that strike. And you're getting used to absorbing that impact and staying steady under that impact. And you do it like all over your body, on your arms, on your legs. There's all sorts of different ways of training this. Old school people will use like the wooden dummy or just a tree or a post where you like smack your arms and smack your body against it. If you've got a partner, they can hit you. I think there's some videos on maybe Addie's YouTube channel of us doing some of those kind of striking drills where It's just like you stand there, your friend just wails on all the way around your body except your face and just like builds up the power to the point where you say, I can't handle it, and you tap out. And then you go, cool, that was my limit today. And then you rinse and repeat that and you kind of push that limit so you can handle more and more power. I mean, a bit of the point is just getting used to the fact that your body is much, much more resilient than you expect. And if you can take a lot of power to the body, then you only really have to be concerned about protecting your face if there's a really violent situation that doesn't have weapons involved. Um, and more interestingly than this, what it does is it makes you feel resilient in the face of any kind of pressure. So again, you train iron shirt for a bit, and everyone I've ever done it with, and myself, I noticed this. You start to feel more confident. You don't worry about people yelling at you if you have an opinion different to them. So you're starting to be a little bit more free to express yourself, and it starts to become okay. This is like a verbal or emotional confrontation. The worst place it will go is if it gets physical, and I can deal with a bit of physical. I can take a hit, and I know I'm not going to die. It might be a little uncomfortable at most. Maybe I'll have a bruise for a day or two, but I'm going to be pretty okay. This does something psychologically to us. This does something to our habitual reactions to things. If you train this um, kind of iron shirt type of thing where you can just absorb a lot of impact and not be too bothered by it. And, again, to take my friend Addy as an example, I can just take the biggest wind up of a punch I have and just hit him as hard as I possibly can. And he'll just look at me with a blank face. It's like hitting a tire tube, for one. The quality of his body is very particular. But I asked him later, like, does that hurt? He's like, yeah, a little bit. Like, it's not like there's no sensation there. It can be an intense sensation, but he's trained to meet that intense sensation quite a lot. He's also another person, by the way, who's done a lot of like bouncing and also done some MMA fights. So he's well experienced in actual fighting. But nevertheless, even if you're not, training this kind of iron shirt is a real way to build this sense of like confidence in yourself. The receptive capacity, it'll also make you better at listening, because when you can absorb and receive power, if someone's yelling at you, instead of trying to get out of the way, you just let them yell at you and then let the yelling come in. And it's like, yeah, it's not going to do much to me. It's just kind of vocal noise. Whereas if you haven't trained that, you might be trying to get out of the way of that kind of barrage of words. So the iron shirt's really good for this kind of thing. On the flip side, all of the striking and the expressing of power is also something really interesting. I train this with my students quite regularly, particularly the ladies. Very, very good to learn how to express your power, because unfortunately we're in a society where that gets dialed down, if I'm to put it politely, but really like society's smothering the ladies expressing anything that might offend someone. So learning to do this with your fist first, learning to let out a lot of power and seeing that you can let out a lot of power with a bit of training. If you learn to strike and if you learn to do penetrating strikes and things like this, it's not like you're learning how to do this in the chaos of a real fight. It's just within some drills. But even within those drills, that's going to teach you how to take something inside and express it outwardly with a bit of oomph. And again, not worrying about does it work in a fight, this translates into day-to-day experience when you talk to people, when you raise an opinion with someone, when you're, maybe you want to like get a point across to someone. And if you're not willing to express yourself physically, it's very, very difficult to express yourself emotionally or mentally. So it can be really good to just train like letting it out and letting it rip and letting as much power out as you can. And what I find over and over again is in the start, people constrain themselves. Like you go to hit and you can see they can make power. You can see, that it should all come out, and they like stop. And part of that is like, the first thing that comes out when I train this is like, they'll say something like, I don't want to hurt you. And when you've trained iron shirt, it's like, that's not nice, dear. You're probably not going to hurt me. So what's the next level, right? And to give you some context for these drills, I'll stand there and say, like, strike me on the chest as hard as you can. knowing that I've trained my chest a lot to be struck reasonably hard, so it's unlikely they're going to do much more than put a little bit of a bruise. So then, as this like constraint is noticed and then released, the person who's being trained lets out more and more and more power, and suddenly, often a lot of like stuff that's stored inside that's being kept inside and held and they haven't let out because, all sorts of reasons, worried about what society will say about them or what their family will say about them or what their friends or whatever, starts to be released and starts to come out. And trained intelligently, this can over time actually like let out a bunch of stored stuff and teach you how to let it out on the fly so you don't have to store it in. It doesn't mean you get to be rude and an idiot and just say what's on your mind to everyone, but it just means you're not always holding it in no matter what because you're worried, about what might the consequences be. So martial drills, iron shirt, striking power, very, very good for day-to-day life for these reasons. Um, on top of that, there is a coordinative aspect to most of the martial drilling. Right hand here, left hand there. You've got some complex thing to do to change the hands from here to there, to lift up to there and go under there. All of that coordination with like getting the hand-eye and the hand-foot coordination and the body and hand coordination working well is, from a physical standpoint, just totally valuable. It's really, really going to do a lot for the way you relate to your body, where you know where your body is, how it's arranged compared to the other people that are around you, where the leverages are, where the danger spots are, things like this. Getting that coordination that if my hands get tangled this way, I can untangle them this way and get them out. Understanding the lines and the angles that can be used and the nuances of that angle. It really does a lot for the anchoring in reality, for the mind body link, right? To notice that mind and body are actually an expression of one thing, and that when you kind of see someone moving a particular way and you're connected to your body, you can kind of replicate that. And so there are lots of these drills that have like patterns. A lot of the martial drills that I like also have rhythms. So if you have like some of the stick fighting drills are like ta 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 ta, this kind of like 1, 2, 3 rhythm that you keep up. And rhythmic work is really, really interesting. Rhythmic work combined with coordination is really, really interesting for physical development. So in my history, I was always quite physically able, and I'll put 99% of that down to the traditional martial arts I trained. We're training this method that was like a long fist type thing, with deep stances, going to jumps, coordination. I've got to jump and somehow turn my leg and get out there, and then I've got to make sure my hands aren't flying in the wrong way. And there's all this like arranging and orienting the body around these moves and trying to get the moves to express more freely that gave me a real athletic base. My legs got strong. I was able to jump really high. I was able to move with speed. I knew my left from my right. I knew my hands from my feet. The intricate footwork helps me learn my legs really clearly. And I remember going into like the calisthenics realm where there was this whole movement in the early, like late 2009 through 2012 where calisthenics weren't a thing yet. And people were dubious about whether you could build strength without using any weights at all and just using like body weight, like calisthenics exercises. And of course you can these days, it's obvious, but the leg training is still, and to this day is still reasonably lacking in variety. It's just variations on a squat, like single leg squat or double leg squat of some degree. And the traditional martial arts really train the legs in quite a particular way that I would say is the only other art that comes close is something like contemporary dance or ballet. That the legs get a huge variety of arrangement, interaction with the ground, how to absorb forces, how to express forces, how to move quickly, how to be coordinated in all sorts of situations. So it's really, really profoundly wonderful for the athletic capacities of the body to keep the body reasonably healthy, with a little caveat star there that I did actually overtrain a lot of this stuff and had to undo that, so I wouldn't train the way I did when I started. But still, there's huge value in learning this stuff, particularly if you're younger. Particularly if you're in your teens and 20s and 30s. But even getting into middle age and older age, the uncles of China are very famous. The uncles and aunties in the park training crazy stuff as they get on into their 80s. And all the traditional martial artists of China, I don't care whether they can fight or not. Those guys are like 90 and move better than most 25-year-olds in Western culture. So this is where the traditional arts are really interesting for me from a cultivation perspective. So to cultivate the physical body, to cultivate the mind, to cultivate the mind-body relationship, the emotions, how you deal with conflict, all of this kind of stuff is super, super, super well placed in the traditional martial arts, and I think enormously valuable in our modern era. I think more people need to do traditional martial arts for this reason, not to learn to fight. Go to a place that does fighting if you want to learn to fight, but learn the traditional martial arts. Even if you never really fight, they can really do a lot of good stuff for you. Just be clear about what you're doing. So maybe a word we can use for this is like martial cultivation or something like this. Using martial arts to cultivate yourself rather than using martial arts to get good at fighting. And if we differentiate that and be clear about that, then I think it'll save everyone a lot of headaches and a lot of surprises. And the people that are into fighting can go do fighting. And the geeks like me who just want to cultivate themselves and get some physical capacity and get some capacity to receive and express force, and to train that in a really fun but challenging way that you can step up the pressure, then that's like the perfect place for the traditional martial arts, I think. Yeah, so maybe we'll leave it there. It's a big topic. I could probably go on and on and on about it, but just consider, if you're a martial artist, just consider these kind of basic things. What are you training? Are you actually training to get good at fighting? Um, if you're training your internal qualities in Tai Chi and you're punging people away and whatever, just like, what does that do for your life? Put it that way. So, to give an example, we were training a bit of this kind of structural stuff and, kind of drills that look a bit, that wouldn't work in the cage if I put it online with my students, of course, bouncing people and all the rest. And I said to my students, I said, it's not like you're going to use this. It's not going to work in a fight. You're walking down the street. It's not like you're just going to run up to random people and like gin blast them away and make them fall over and go, ha ha ha, I'm superior. It's like, what's the point of it? And if you keep clear on that, and so I was bringing it back to use this to just understand how you're relating to yourself in a slightly more chaotic mode. And we're working on those relationships in my classes at any point in time. So I keep pointing them back to that and keep reminding them, hey, this isn't a martial drill. It's slightly more pressure than no pressure, but it's not quite at the level of someone trying to tear your face off martial drill, which you need to train at if you want to be martially applicable. So I think it's good just as a sign off for this episode to just, if you're training martial arts, maybe keep that in mind. Maybe have a good think about why you're doing it. And, even if you are training to be like the ultimate fighter, why? Why do you want to be this person who can just tear heads off people and whatever? I get some people have the warrior archetype in them, but these questions are worth asking and worth exploring, particularly from a cultivation perspective. So I hope that's been useful to someone. Always happy to geek out about martial cultivation. For the martial arts, I don't do it too much myself. I have some friends who do. I have fun training with them. I just don't have much opportunity to train in that method, and it's not something I go out of my way to find. So secondary, tertiary, whatever is beyond tertiary. What's the fourth fourth way of saying that? Quadtertiary, something like this. Priority for me, and not something that's front and center at all. I'm into the cultivation, not into the fighting. if I study fighting, it's for cultivation purposes, not to be a badass fighter. So I'll leave it there. Enjoy what little of May is left, and I'll hopefully catch you next month with another topic of some kind.